Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Andrew Pilliar. I am an associate professor at TRU, Thompson Rivers University, and I'm delighted to chair today's panel. First panel, this one on justice epidemiology. I'm going to do very brief introductions of all our panelists since we have six. We're going to try and move through and try and save enough time for questions at the end. It is my pleasure to introduce Ryan Sakoda, who is an associate professor at the University of Iowa College of Law. To Ryan's right is Delphine Bellerose, who's a principal researcher at the Law and Justice Foundation of New South Wales. To Delphine's right is Kerryn Butler, who is also a principal researcher at the Law and Justice Foundation of New South Wales. To Kerryn's right is Chris Povey, who is the CEO of Justice Connect. To Chris's right is Paul Prettitore, who is a senior public sector specialist at the World Bank and visiting scholar at Queen's University Belfast, and just me. We have an order that will hopefully fit together, but I'd like to invite Kerryn to start us off.
Thank you. Good morning. Today I would like to share a recent project that we did. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Emily Coffer and Katrina Merles-Black. The increasing intensity and unpredictability of natural disasters, both in Australia and globally, highlights the urgency of addressing the legal needs of affected individuals in a responsive and targeted way. As climate change accelerates, the frequency and severity of natural disasters is increasing, leading to overlapping crises and compounding the experience of legal problems. Our recently published report is the first to provide a comprehensive summary of what is known about disaster-related legal need in the Australian context. In addition to the evidence review, the report presents analysis of 3 years of client services delivered by the Legal Aid New South Wales Disaster Response Legal Service. This service is a statewide specialist legal service that responds to and assists individuals and communities that have been impacted by disasters in New South Wales. The service is mobilised in response to trigger events across the state. For those of you who do not know, New South Wales is a large geographic area of approximately 800,000 square kilometres, and the population is about 8 million, which is a third of the Australian population. So the report addresses 3 main areas of knowledge that are vital for understanding disaster legal need. The volume of disaster legal need, including when in the disaster cycle legal need is likely to be experienced, the nature of that need, including the types of problems that people and communities experience, and an exploration of how legal needs manifest for different subgroups within the Australian population. Today, I'm just going to share a very top-level summary of findings. The report primarily reports on activities within the response and recovery phases, although one of the gaps in evidence that we found were activities undertaken in the preparedness phase. And we will soon be publishing a report that seeks to fill that gap, and we expect that to be available before the end of the year. So we found clear evidence of disaster-related legal need at all stages of the disaster cycle, and the pattern of this need changes over time and is influenced by the characteristics of individual disasters. After a disaster, there is an initial surge in legal need, primarily related to issues with shelter and basic human needs. This legal need can persist alongside later presenting issues that continue long into the recovery phase. We also found that the complexity of legal problems at an individual level is not directly correlated to the scale of the disaster at a community level. In other words, the scale or size of a particular flood or fire, for example, does not predict the volume or complexity of legal needs that individuals experience. While this seems obvious, the implication for service providers is that small-scale disasters cannot predict the scale of legal need in the community. So, for instance, the legal aid service we worked with on this often have to decide when to mobilise services, and this work was able to demonstrate that the geographic scale of a disaster alone could not predict the volume or complexity of legal need, but that other considerations must be taken into account. The post-disaster period is characterised by a striking breadth of disaster-related legal problems. While many legal problems people experience during disaster response and recovery are similar to those that are experienced in everyday life, just with an increase in frequency or severity, other problems are novel to the disaster context. Not surprisingly, we found that insurance, government grants and housing accounts for a substantial volume of legal need in some settings. And providing assistance related to these areas of law will be important in meeting disaster-related legal need. The breadth of novel legal problems that people experience poses challenges for legal assistance providers in ensuring they have adequate resources and expertise to provide assistance across many different areas of law. This necessitates a multifaceted approach that integrates local knowledge and expertise across these various areas of law. So service models must be flexible and responsive and reflect the unique needs and characteristics of each community. So regarding who experiences legal need, there's clear evidence that the types of legal problems that people encounter are influenced by the type and scale of the disaster and by the characteristics of the community affected. Importantly, natural disasters can be expected to compound existing inequalities of legal need across the community. We know that different groups within the community have distinct legal needs. Most groups that are already known to be vulnerable to high levels of need would be expected to experience increased legal need following natural disasters. However, there are specific legal problems that are likely to differentially impact different groups. Service delivery models should incorporate known characteristics of disaster-affected populations, both in terms of the expected types of legal problems and the preferred modes of service delivery, to ensure those services are well positioned to meet the needs. Delphine will expand on this point in the next presentation. So the disproportionate impact of disasters on vulnerable demographic groups and the distinct legal needs of such groups underscores the need for targeted, flexible approaches and tailored support services. Recognising and understanding the specific impacts of these groups can aid in service delivery planning. So the full report includes a detailed examination of the key issues highlighted in this presentation and incorporates evidence from a range of legal assistance providers across a range of Australian jurisdictions. Service data allows us to comprehensively explore the experience of multiple concurrent legal problems, examine the influence of disaster characteristics on a number of problems experienced by affected individuals, and investigate the co-occurrence of problems to identify common clusters of legal problems. We also present innovative exploration of trends in service utilisation across multiple disasters of different types. So you can find this resource and other Foundation research at the Foundation website, which is www.lawfoundation.net.au, or you can scan the QR code. And if you've got any questions about the report, please don't hesitate to grab me in the break. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerryn. That was amazing. And I didn't even get to my 2-minute warning. Oh, no. Fantastic. And next up is Delphine.
Good morning. So in this presentation today, I would like to bounce off some of the findings from our disaster-related legal need project, which you've just heard about, and consider some practical applications to help support the delivery of legal assistance services. So what do we know about disaster-related legal need? This is not a test. I know you were all paying attention, so I'm going to go quite quickly. We know that the type and the scale of disaster will have an influence on the nature of legal need. However, as we have just heard, not necessarily on the complexity of problems experienced or the severity. It doesn't tell us about the volume of legal need, but it might give us a few insights on the types of problems being experienced. We also know that the characteristics of the community affected will also influence the nature of legal need, and this is what I'm going to focus on now. So here's our little community impacted by a disaster. Within this community, different people will have experienced different types of legal issues. They'll also experience different challenges in addressing those issues, and they may or may not access services, and when they do, they might access services in different ways. So what does it all mean for legal assistance service providers? Well, local providers are obviously part of the community. The chances are they're impacted as well. Assuming they can operate at all, it's not business as usual. They see more clients. They're faced with new problems, some of which they may not have expertise with, and they have to operate in an environment that is highly disrupted, especially when it comes to referral pathways. What about other providers? As Kerryn alluded earlier, we do have in New South Wales a specialist statewide service called the Disaster Response Legal Service. They have to deliver services in areas they are not familiar with. They also have to make very swift decisions about a number of things, such as which recovery centre to attend. The chances are they not have enough staff to attend all of them, what legal expertise might be required, and what service delivery model is feasible and most appropriate for the community and the area and the different impact of the actual disaster. So how do they go about answering all these questions and making these decisions? Well, first, of course, emergency management agencies can provide information on the scale of the disaster. This may be the number of houses that have been lost. It may also be something as just a precise list of areas or the localities officially declared impacted by a natural disaster. But as we know now, this is not enough. They obviously rely on these past experiences, but what about the local community? What about understanding how the affected community and what does this look like? So when we ask disaster response services about those questions, and I say we, but really I need to give credit here to our colleague Emily Cothy, who's not with us today. She worked really closely with disaster response services during this project. When Emily asked them those questions, this is the answer she was given. So they do internet search to find information such as the size of the population affected, maybe the proportion of First Nations population, and any information they can find to give them an indication of the extent to which the area might be socioeconomically disadvantaged or not. But by and large, they told us that it's quite difficult to find relevant data specifically for the area or community that is impacted. Now, over the last number of years at the Law and Justice Foundation of New South Wales, we have done a fair bit of work in assessing legal need and mapping legal need across Australia, drawing on publicly available data. We have developed a number of resources, and the Community Profiles dashboard that you can now see on the screen is one of them. Now, I don't have enough time today to walk you through the dashboard in detail, and I'm only going to provide a few screenshots, which I do realize does a very poor job at showcasing an interactive resource, but I will provide a QR code at the end for those of you who may be interested. So this dashboard provides a series of indicators. They range from broad population indicators to indicators that have been associated with increased prevalence of legal need. So indicators of disadvantage, such as being at risk of homelessness, having a low income, different subgroups within the community, children and young people, older people, First Nations people. Also indicators related to health, disability and mental health condition. And I do know that there is a presentation on the intersections between health and legal need, which I believe is happening right now in the other panel. Too bad you're missing it. And also more specific indicators in relation to domestic and family violence, GV-related criminal incidents. Now let me tie this back to our disaster context. Australia, New South Wales, in the northeastern corner of New South Wales, in a region called the Northern Rivers. You can see why on this map. Now this is a region prone to flooding. Many houses in this area are raised. Most residents know about flood. The chances are they've already lived through one. They have a plan, they kind of know what to do. However, that said, nothing could have prepared them for the scale of the disaster that they faced in February and March 2023. This picture is taken in Lismore. This is the largest town in this area. This is Lismore, several meters on the water in March 2023. This photo was viral in the news. This is possibly the most famous McDonald's signs in New South Wales. Now going back to our dashboard. Using the dashboard, we can select precisely the area that has been impacted by the disaster. And using any of the indicators I mentioned earlier, we can put together a bit of a profile of this area, ranging from the population that is affected. We can see on this map where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people population is most concentrated. Low proficiency in English, comparatively very low count. This is not an indicator particularly relevant for this area. It would be a lot more relevant in areas closer to major cities such as Sydney or Melbourne. And we can see, however, that well over a third of the population, the adult population, is on low personal income. Now, as I said earlier, this dashboard is one of the resources we have available. Here is another one. Same concept. This dashboard shows the Foundation's need for legal assistance services indicators, or NLAS indicators. NLAS indicators draw from census data and identify and count people with potentially lower legal capability by combining variables such as low income and low educational attainment, or low income and low English proficiency. This dashboard also shows information in relation to most commonly spoken languages other than English in any given area. I will conclude just by saying, of course, indicators that draw from census data, such as NLAS indicators, or social services data, or other publicly available data, will not tell you anything, in fact, about the changes on the volume and nature of legal needs, specifically in the event of a natural disaster. But they do provide readily available information to help support the planning and delivery of services in the initial disaster response phase, but also in the more long-term disaster preparedness phase. As promised, this is the QR code for the Community Profiles dashboard. Now, I should warn you, it's not particularly mobile friendly. If you have a laptop, I'd recommend you access the dashboard straight from our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Delphine. Another masterclass in going under time. This is amazing. Next, and continuing with the Australian theme, I'd like to turn it over to Chris.
I've got some slides as well, if that's right. I've done that thing where, you know, you've got slides, but they don't necessarily have a lot to do with what you're going to say. So, which ones are mine? This one's here. So it's just kind of something for you to look at if you get sick of looking at me, I guess. Good to see you all. I'm CEO of Justice Connect. We're a community legal centre based in Australia. We've got offices in Victoria, in Melbourne, and in New South Wales. So one of the things I really like about this panel is we've got a bit of a mix of academic and deep thought about some of the work that's going on, particularly in relation to disaster work, and that work really informs what we do, as well as some of the work that's perhaps happening in organisations like ours on the ground, sort of, responding to the work. So at Justice Connect, we're a service that delivers a lot of assistance in different areas. So we help people who are at risk or experiencing homelessness, people at risk of or experiencing elder abuse, people that turn up to court alone. We also help not-for-profit organisations, because community organisations, just like individuals, have legal needs, and there's often not a lot of places to go. You know, Simon Sinek, the management thinker, talks about nobody wants to know how the sausage gets made, the why. People want to know more about the why, they don't want to know about the how. At Justice Connect, we do care about the why and the how. I think the way that we work is really important, and I'm really pleased that a number of my colleagues from the sector who are very invested in integrated wrap-around supports are here at the conference. We deliver high-intensity service provision, as well as being really interested in how to stretch the help. So our current strategy is looking at how to provide more assistance to people, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, I can do it. Oh, clicker. It's rocket science, right? Yeah, so I'm going to be talking more about some of the digital stuff, maybe less so some of that high-intensity support. We also work really closely with pro bono lawyers who have a really big role to play in our disaster response, which is also something I'm going to be talking about today. All right, I've talked about that. See, there you go. I mean, it's like a bit of a surprise box, these slides. So for me, a really key memory about the disaster work that we do at Justice Connect came from 2009. And so this was when I was in another role at Justice Connect, and then I left the organisation and then I came back as CEO. In 2009, I was leading our homelessness team, and there were catastrophic fires in Australia, and we wanted to do something. Everyone wanted to do something, and quite often you find in disasters everyone's very keen to get involved and help out, and people have this kind of upswelling feeling of wanting to do something. So we went out to a small community on the fringe of Melbourne called Healesville. We were at a relief centre. We were sitting there and just hanging out, talking to each other all day. Nobody came to see us. Nobody needed legal advice on that day. They needed emergency relief. They needed food. They may have needed emergency accommodation. They needed to be able to connect with people, get mobile phones and clothes and all those sorts of things. They didn't need us. So that was a really interesting individual lesson about how legal need manifests in disasters. And I think over the years, I mean, at that point, we didn't have a lot of the research that we have now that informs how we need to think about what that need looks like. But I also think at that point, you had a lot of these individual pro bono firms kind of going, yes, I want to help, yes, I want to help. And it was not necessarily a good experience for the people that experienced that kind of need. So that was something that we were really interested in. A couple of the points that inform how we think about disaster at Justice Connect: this idea of the surge in demand and the complexity of the need. Oh God, it impacts. Here we go. Another random slide. This is a bit about Justice Connect, sorry. Moving into the guts of it, drier, hotter summers and so on, to the disaster context. This is easy to read for everyone. So I think it sort of says the complexity side of things. Anyway, at least there are slides. You know, I feel like that's a positive thing. So surge in demand and complexity, I think that's a really important thing for us. There is a lot of need, but one of the things that you notice from my experience in 2009 was the need necessarily isn't at that kind of first acute stage, but one of the things you do notice, a disaster can have years and years and years of need that trail after it. One of the things that I think is interesting about looking at profiles, for example, of communities and looking at the disadvantage, of course that matters. One of the things that I think is interesting about how need presents is that you have a different profile of people that have legal needs. So our sector is understandably and appropriately very focused on people with significant disadvantage and high need. And I think people that present with legal need from a disaster might be kind of unusual suspects, people that we haven't normally seen. And how do we respond to that when all of our funding, all of our targeting is about people with a specific type of profile. That's something for us to think about. So I've talked about the long-term impacts on need. So the challenges for legal services, so we are a metropolitan city-based service. We are not on boots on the ground. So I think a lot of the research about what local services are grappling with is really important. I think for us, something that we need to consider about is how digital services can get knocked out. I think there are a range of different issues that we need to consider there when we're rolling out digital responses. I think funding is a mess. Funding kind of goes up and down like this. Government gets kind of shamed into providing a lot of funding, then it all evaporates. So you can't deliver a consistent service, which is really a story of access to justice in Australia, unfortunately, to some extent. So one of the things that we did after, this is going to be a surprise as well, here we go, using technology, deep partnerships, co-designing with community. So I think that's another really important part. Anything that we do, we have a very close relationship with the people with whom we work and the organisations, and they are central to however we develop systems and responses. So if I take the 2009 example, in 2019, you might not remember, but there were more catastrophic fires in Australia. These are the ones you could see from space. Disastrous. I remember it was summer in Australia, we were at the beach, and it was like something out of Blade Runner. For weeks and weeks and weeks, clouds, and we were miles and miles from the fires, but it was orange. You couldn't see the sun. It was horrendous. And at that point, there was lots of things being done. Lots of firms wanted to help again, and there's this risk of pro bono tripping over itself. At that point, we had developed what's called our pro bono portal, which is a way of coordinating the response and the need. So effectively, people can apply online using a platform that we have developed. And then firms are able to browse the list of people who've applied for help and select matters that they can assist with. So instead of people going to firm A, can you help, and then no to firm B, and stuff going all over the place, this central coordinated response, and we've had hundreds and hundreds of people go through that piece of software, that platform, and also we've had, that's a kind of a coordinating function. And I'm not talking in this presentation about the range of coordination work that's happening in the sector, and there is a lot of it, and that has been a huge step forward. We've got about 10,000 lawyers on it. Last year there were 700 opportunities. 2 minutes, God. See, look at this. Lucky you went quickly because, I can take your 10 minutes that you left behind. I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. All right. So portal, I've talked about that. Disaster Legal Resource Hub, in the last year alone, we've created 77 resources that have been viewed thousands of times. So information, scalability with the digital work that we're doing is really very, very important. Diagnostic AI models. So we're working at different levels. So this is a tool that's about helping people identify what type of legal issue they have, which is about unlocking access to information. So if you don't know what your legal issue is, you can't get information to help you. Our Get E-Prepared, I really like this project. This is about helping people prepare for disaster. So this idea of all stages of the disaster response, preparedness, and so on. It's focused, and this is a corporate partnership, it's focused at people with low levels of digital literacy, and that's something as well at Justice Connect we need to be very mindful of. It's about how people prepare by securing documents. So about their insurance documents, their leases, all of these sorts of things, their driver's license, their passports, which can make life very, very hard post a disaster. And a lot of people just don't know how to take photos with their iPhone or to upload things to the cloud. And so that's been accessed thousands of times, and more than 2,000 people have secured their documents using that tool. And finally, Justice Connect Answers, which is an online clinic where people can ask individual questions about matters. And we find that for disasters, that's quite helpful. You might not want to engage with a lawyer for the whole thing, but you might want to have a little bit of information. Rush towards the end, but that's me done. Will be time for questions at the end. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Chris. I still haven't used all of my warning cards. This is fantastic. All right, moving continents, over to Ryan.
All right. Thank you for inviting us here to present. This is my first time at the International Access to Justice Forum, so I'm very excited to be here. And I'm working on this project with Brian Farrow, who's right here, and Daria Fisher-Page. And there's also another co-author on the general project, Eric Tate, who's a geographer at Princeton that we've been working with. And so this is a project that follows on very nicely with the work of the Law and Justice Foundation. And it sounds like we're trying to do something similar in the US context with this project. And so I have a lot of slides here, so I'm going to go relatively quickly. But the first slides are just kind of trying to position what we're trying to do in kind of a general framework of how we've thought about the access to justice gap. So this is an empirical project where we're trying to contribute to getting at better measures of the access to justice gap. And so just to kind of start off our thinking of where we might be able to contribute, we've thought of this very basic framework, but it helps to figure out where we would like to contribute. And so just the basic justice gap we're seeing as the difference between the legal need and what we're calling legal resilience. And so legal need, we're saying that the couple components, basic components, are this concept of legal vulnerability, which we define as kind of the risk that a justice problem will arise for an individual. And then we're kind of, for now, we're putting to the side all of the other contextual factors that could also contribute to a legal need arising. And then legal resilience is whether there's a supply of legal resources, whether that be lawyers or libraries or other types of legal information, and then whether there's access to that supply. So that's kind of our general framework of what the justice gap is. And so our project is just looking at this legal vulnerability aspect. What is the risk that someone will have a justice problem arise? Okay. So this kind of slide in more words kind of defines each of these characteristics and is essentially talking about what I just described as kind of the legal need is this general justice problem requiring application of legal expertise. And then the legal vulnerability where we're focusing is this probability that these individual characteristics will be correlated with a justice problem arising. Other contextual factors is kind of a catch-all, that catch-all. And then legal resilience is the ability for individuals to actually address their legal needs, and that would come through access to a supply of legal resources. And so just the reason why we kind of thought about approaching this project is in the context of thinking of legal vulnerability in the rural context, where we know from previous presentations at this conference that there are a lot of wonderful legal needs surveys that really get at some nuance and can design questions that get at legal needs in the population of people where the legal needs surveys can be conducted. But we know that those can be very expensive and very time consuming, and there's oftentimes a limited population that they can cover. And so in the reality where we cannot necessarily have detailed legal needs surveys across the country, oftentimes we see legal needs surveys not covering certain areas, such as kind of rural areas. So kind of thinking in terms of that, we wanted to think about a way that we could get at some aspect of what we're calling legal vulnerability, or this kind of risk of legal or justice problems arising that would cover a broader range of geographies. And so we think that this, in terms of, especially in the rural community, might be a more accurate proxy than some of the other measures of counting up attorneys per capita across the country, that we might be able to get at a range of different types of interventions that we would want to have information about as to whether or not supply of those interventions might be helpful. Also, kind of getting away from where a lot of the research has happened in kind of urban areas, this urban normativity of a lot of the research and information that's available currently, and then having kind of a more broader nationwide scope of our measures would facilitate comparisons between different geographies. Okay, so kind of generally, we can look at the access to justice gap in terms of these two dimensions of legal resilience and legal need. And if there's high legal need, and low legal resilience or low supply, then that's going to create the largest access to justice gap. That's what you see in red. And then where there's a lot of supply and access to legal services and resources, and there's low legal need or legal vulnerability, that's going to be the lower right-hand corner where there's going to be the smallest access to justice gap. One way to think about kind of these different components of how we're thinking about this framework of access to justice is through a specific example. So this is just laying out an example where there's these two people and both have high legal vulnerability for a housing justice problem. So that may be because, at first, maybe because they're a renter, and so they're being a renter, they're subject to potential eviction or other issues with their landlord. The first person, we say, might, in terms of other contextual factors that may come in, they may live in a county with negative factors that includes housing shortage and pro-landlord laws. But we could have another person that lives in a county with the same pro-landlord laws, but in a place where there's abundance of housing. So their risk based on those factors would be lower because those other contextual factors with the abundance of housing would make there less pressure on them or less possibility that a landlord would be more aggressive at pursuing an eviction. Instead of, in terms of legal need, kind of from that vulnerability and the other contextual factors, we may see a legal need arising for the first individual because this housing shortage makes it easier and less costly for a landlord to pursue eviction. On the right-hand side, the person may not be evicted because the landlord doesn't want an empty unit. So they may pursue resolution of any issues that come up outside of the kind of eviction process. So those are kind of two examples of how the other contextual factors may differ in terms of how that produces an actual manifested legal need. And then we can think of other ways that different geographies may differ in terms of supply and access to legal resources, and ultimately whether there's legal resilience that differs between different geographies. Okay. So what we want to do is measure the legal vulnerability aspect of this. So these are looking at different characteristics of individuals that may be correlated with the higher risk of facing a justice problem in different areas of law. And our terminology there mainly it comes from following on what the social vulnerability index, which is a measure in the kind of disaster sciences and geography literature, which is looking at kind of much like I think what was talked about by the Law and Justice Foundation of, whether if you have a disaster, you're a victim of a disaster, your community is a victim of a disaster, or to what extent are the social and economic factors going to make you less likely to be able to meet the needs that come from that, and then also get back to the place you are or be resilient from those, the damage that comes from those disasters. So here we're thinking about that in terms of legal need more broadly. And just an idea of kind of what we're doing, we can think that even one census variable may give us some information that we may want to know about, for example, housing, vulnerability to possible housing legal issues. And so this is just a map of Iowa with incomes of households, or households with incomes of less than $50,000 and who spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And so you can see that the darker areas are ones where there are a larger population under that criteria. And here is kind of Wayne County. This is where Detroit is, so kind of a nearby county. And so you can see how a map just of this one variable might be helpful for legal aid organizations to understand where there might be issues. So kind of generally, we're trying to create this publicly and easily accessible resource that uses data that's publicly and easily accessible so that people can kind of play with that data, that has a simple structure and can be replicated, facilitates cross-jurisdictional comparisons, and that we want to create, just like I think the Law and Justice Center already has, like a website with maps so that you can actually look at the differences between these different areas of legal vulnerability across geographies. And currently what we plan to do is try to look at different areas of law, housing law, employment law, family law, consumer law, and public benefits, and create indices, sub-indices for that, and then together they'll create a general legal vulnerability index. And so that's what we're currently working on. And this is a starting point, so we come to this project with a lot of modesty to understand that this is not going to be the only measure that would, or even a measure that would be the only thing that a particular legal aid organization would point to, but it would just be a piece that may provide some information that would be helpful, and it may lead them to say, maybe we should look more into this particular community. And so that's how we're thinking about this index, and we hope that there'll be a lot of revisions or suggestions and things like that that will come from kind of starting this project up, and we anticipate that it'll be improved over multiple iterations. So I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you, Ryan. We're only past halfway through the panel, and already so many such fascinating connections between the presentations already. Next, over to Paul.
Yeah, I'm worried I'm going to ruin that trend of connecting all of the different things. So thanks for throwing that up 3 seconds before I walk up here. So anyway, hi, my name is Paul Prettitore. I'm a senior specialist at the World Bank, and I feel a bit of an anomaly here because I'm not a researcher by profession. I'm not a professor. You will see by the quality of my PowerPoint and my presentation skills that this is not something I do quite often, though Chris lowered the bar a little bit from our previous 3, so thank you. But Ryan brought it back up, so thanks. But anyway, it's maybe once a year that I get to spend time in a group like this, which is people who try to think a little bit like me. Most of my time at the World Bank is spent with economists and engineers and people who work on health and education. So I approach what I do from a very different perspective because I exist in a very different world where people don't think like me or talk like me or see the world in the way that I see the world. I remember once explaining to a friend who is an economist about a survey I had read about 70% of women in Morocco couldn't enforce decisions on alimony and child support, and getting this kind of, okay, it sounds terrible, but like, so what? Why should I really care about this? Explain to me why this is a big deal. So it's that kind of interaction that's a bit guided me in how I've been approaching this research. Also, my audience, again, is not so much people like here, but I hope it's interesting to you. But to make a case in the development world of why governments should be investing in this, I have to talk to people who don't know about this sector, don't understand this sector, and don't see its relevance. And I deal with government officials who are balancing decisions on whether they should invest in early childhood education or vaccination or food program or disaster risk mitigation or access to justice. So my kind of not completely well thought out or well-designed slide is this concept of the distribution of justice. And distribution I kind of picked up from my economist colleagues because I think it also sounds kind of cool. But when I discuss these things, and access to justice, for me, it becomes a question of access for whom. And then, we've talked about the law-thick world, but, when you're entangled in this law-thick world, it means different things for different groups of people. My organization works mostly on poverty alleviation and shared prosperity, but anti-poverty is usually the driving force behind what we do. So I came up with the idea of distribution of justice, looking at burdens that justice causes and opportunities that justice presents us, what this means for development impacts. And when I talk about development impacts, this is one place where we kind of don't have to reinvent the wheel, because we know a lot about what is important for long-term development, things like early childhood education, birth weight. I mean, there's all these cool things that the economists work on that you can kind of just plug right into and see how justice affects them. And then seeing, trying to translate this into development policy, because normally I'm sitting in front of a minister or a deputy minister or director and trying to explain to them, what this should mean for your government policies. So we were luckily enough, a couple of years ago, we worked with Hill, Innovating Justice. They gave us access to, this was 5 years ago, about 14 of their surveys at the time. And we wanted to test 3 theories. I mean, the first was, are low-income people more likely to experience a legal problem, whether they're more likely to be overrepresented with certain type of legal problems, and whether the impact on them was more adversely negative. From the initial analysis of those surveys, it seemed quite apparent that lower income, not always the lowest income category, sometimes there's a little bit of a bump, the people right around the poverty or just above poverty that were most likely to report a legal problem. This held pretty consistent across the countries that we looked at. Again, we broke this all into income quartiles, whether low-income people are more likely to experience certain type of problems. This held relatively true as well. Whether the legal problems were more impactful, low-income people tended to suffer from cases that had the highest impact or more likely to report negative impact. So we decided to take a second look at this and also see what we can do now that legal needs surveys have become a bit more sophisticated. There's more data available. They're asking different types of questions. So Hill once again gave us access to 4 of their most recent surveys, which I think are between 2022 and 2024, which was Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Tunisia. The other anomaly is I work with low and middle income countries, not high income countries, so that's also a big difference. So going back to those 3 hypotheses, I think, whether low income are more likely to suffer a legal problem is a bit up in the air, and I think there might be kind of a middle, low income, and then high income country exception. But also I'm not sure that that's so much relevant anymore, or the most interesting part of it. But what we did find was that low-income people were were overrepresented in certain type of cases. So then working with an economist in my office, she gave me some ideas about how to present the data to economists in the development world that makes a more compelling case. Because I showed her the previous slide and said, look, this, and she said, okay, I see what you're saying, but also, you're telling me things and I don't see it on a graph. So I'm gonna follow what you're saying because I believe you. So this is the new way, and I thought it would be really cool to have scatter plot, and I thought it was sophisticated, but Hugh presented scatter plots the other day. But I have a trend line, so I don't know, maybe that makes sense. But just don't ask about the methodology, because my economist colleague is not here, so I will not have all the answers. But the important thing is that, it kind of held true. What we found looking at the 4 most recent surveys were that low-income people were more likely to experience the most common type of legal problems, and they're more likely to experience those that had the highest reported negative impact. This is also from Nigeria and Tunisia. This was just kind of the general that, low-income people were more likely to have high impact. Again, this is also from the impact on a scale of 1 to 10. We only have the data for Nigeria, so I have to keep begging Hill for new data because every time they give it to me, I tell them it's the last time I'm going to ask, but then I get a new idea, so I'm waiting for the new data. But again, here what it shows is that low-income people are more likely to experience the case types that are reported to be the most negatively impactful. Back to the so what question I get all of the time. What we're hoping with some of this data is then to tie it into development impacts. There are roadmaps for things like this. We did a qualitative survey in Jordan of beneficiaries of legal aid, I think 5 years ago, and it showed things that, access to legal aid, increased access to alimony, it increased people's trust in the judicial system, it broke cycles of abuse. Here's just a couple of examples of a women's justice center in Peru. This was an RCT, showing the intergenerational effects, which are really important for development economists. So where to from here? We're going to keep mining the Hill data as long as they answer my emails requesting more data, and then see where we can take this, because the whole distribution is a concept, and you can apply it to lots of different things, like the really interesting things that Hugh and his colleagues are doing on legal capability. This whole idea of distribution can be placed on that as well. We're going to look at kind of case resolution and justice journeys to see how that burden falls. We want to focus a bit more also on the opportunities that justice, building trust, building people's legal capability and other things. So yeah, that's it. I'm happy to have lots of criticism and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Oh, everybody's being so good at staying on time, so I really have to break this up. I'm joking. I won't. I'll be on time. Okay. Paul, at least you had data. Everybody else has had actual maps and or data. I have none of those things, but I'm hoping to pull back and offer some thoughts on a possible future to see a framework to do more of the work that I've seen on this panel today, which I think is fantastic. So this is mapping and expanding something that I've termed justice epidemiology towards a new subfield. As I began, I want to acknowledge and express my gratitude to be able to live, work, and learn in Tiktaalik-Secwepemc, where my university campus is located, the traditional territory of the Secwepemc people within Secwepemc. The central claims of my presentation here are that we have been missing up until this point, a key piece of institutional infrastructure that will help to understand and improve access to justice problems, something I've referred to as justice epidemiology, and that this could be a new subfield in which which is person-centered and provides a systemic way to understand and respond to access to justice dynamics. And I think in seeing some of the presentations so far, some of what I had hoped to see in the world, I'm seeing already, and that's just utterly amazing. So in the presentation, I am going to explain why I think justice epidemiology is important, what it is. I'll briefly sketch a potential normative framework and some empirical approaches, and then turn to trying to map what this could be, visualizing this field, identifying some areas for further work, and trying to slot some examples of work that we already see in the world into this map of the field. And then I'll finish by outlining what I think could be some useful future steps. So why justice epidemiology? Well, just over 10 years ago, there was a paper by Becky Sandifer and Catherine Albiston expanding the empirical study of access to justice, which called for all sorts of new work, and noticed that we were in the midst of an access to justice renaissance. And I think that's been the case. I hope that continues to be the case. And in the years since, I'm going to speak in a Canadian context for a bit, 2013 was a big year. We saw 3 major reports. The one on the left is a report by the National Self-Represented Litigants Project that took the, I think, then novel step of talking to self-represented litigants to understand what the factors were that were involved in being self-represented and their experiences of moving through justice systems. In the middle is the Equal Justice report by the Canadian Bar Association, which convened a major gathering in Vancouver, and also included numerous calls for things like, among other things, more empirical work, more research to better understand access to justice dynamics. And then on the right is the Roadmap for Change, which was issued by the National Action Committee, then headed by Supreme Court Justice Thomas Cromwell, and which has served as a sort of ongoing rallying call to better and sustainably turn attention to access to justice challenges and to try and affect changes in the culture of the legal profession, but even broader than that in society, to try and address and prevent these problems. Now, in the period between then, I'm really just, you all know that there's been a lot of really fantastic work over the past decade within Canada. A shout out to the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice, Cost of Justice research project, and also in 2019, World Justice Project's Global Insights on Access to Justice. There's been this development of a more robust sense of empirical frameworks to understand and analyze access to justice challenges. And then, of course, we had a pandemic. And so this is relevant for this talk because almost overnight, the tools of epidemiology became very relevant, whether we were aware of them or not, to almost everybody on the planet. even the terminology of describing a pandemic, right, draws from public health and epidemiology, of course. So very briefly, what is this field? Epidemiology certainly has not always been around, and I think it can be instructive to understand that if we go back just over 100 years, we can learn about the development of a field that was non-existent into something that was highly relevant in that period. So there is a very complicated history behind this, but just to very briefly sketch over this, in 1872, the development of the American Public Health Association, international sanitary conferences held between 1850s and 1930s to address outbreaks of disease in countries, generally speaking, in Europe and in North America to some degree. Top-down efforts, but ultimately leading to the establishment of the World Health Organization in 1948. In presenting this, I can't even call that a history. I want to emphasize that there is a very problematic side to the history of the development of public health and epidemiology, and I don't have time to expand on that, but the whole, joinder of public health, sanitary terminology with eugenics and other things is very important to be aware of, and I think that should drive us to be very concerned if we're trying to develop something like a new subfield about what are the norms that should animate something like justice epidemiology. So with that in mind, I think, in my view, some of the people-centered work, the idea, the things that have come out of the OECD guidelines and language used by the Justice Data Observatory is very important. I think it's also important to think about the empirical and theoretical approaches that can inform this subfield. So we might think about understanding how, when, and for whom justiciable problems arise across populations, understanding the paths that people take when they experience justiciable problems, what situations actually amount to access to justice problems, recognizing that law and recourse to legal services isn't necessarily an appropriate or good path, right? That those may not be, justiciable problem is not the same as an access to justice problem. To understand what interventions can prevent and address access to justice problems, and to understand how access to justice problems manifest and affect people and communities across the life course. So not just point in time, but ongoing effects. Justice epidemiology, in my view, differs from legal epidemiology and efforts to link health concerns with legal concerns, which is happening, those discussions in the panel next door. Legal epidemiology is the study of law as a factor in the cause, distribution, and prevention of disease and injury. And so law in some ways is understood as a social health determinant. And while these types of links are very important, and this work is important, justice epidemiology proposes to do something different and to recognize and understand justiciable problems as matters of concern in their own right. I am giving myself a 2-minute warning. Okay, so how can we think about this? In mapping the field, we might take the world, okay? This is, see, you had real maps. This is my idea of a map. If we think of a population, right, we know that there is a significant subset of that population that experiences significant justiciable events over often a 3-year period, okay? Within that, we know that there is a much smaller, this is not to scale, segment of the population that will experience legal services and institutions, okay? So this map of the world I'll come back to, and I'll show where some existing research fits into that. So some areas for work and attention, I think we should be attentive particularly to the norms as this field develops, the implications of people centricity, issues of data sovereignty, decolonization, equity and doing no harm, and how that should affect researchers working in this field. I think in looking at methods, we have to think about what types of surveillance happens, whether that's unmet legal needs surveys, legal capability surveys, ongoing surveys, what types of interventions are effective and how do we know, what steps are effective in prevention. And so areas for work and attention also include the development of things like justice economics, which there's a field of health economics, but we don't have that developed in the justice space. And some data caps certainly exist, including youth and children. institutional responsibility. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to speed through this. Slotting in some things that we already see and some folks who are presenting here. Unmet legal needs surveys, legal capability work, pathways research in that space of people who've experienced justiciable events. There's a lot of work that's being done on those who've encountered legal services, legal process design, RCTs, administrative data, and there's even some work on the outside of this. So I think of Trevor Farrow's work on asking people what their perceptions of access to justice are and what that means. And so finally, in wrapping up, because I'm now over time, the future steps can include, how do we do this on an ongoing basis? Can we have regular gatherings to build relationships and to figure out, what we know and need to know might be an important first gathering, and maybe that's preceded by a comprehensive systemic review and question synthesis. As academics, we tend to like books, so maybe there's a reason to write a book, to give this a name and call it something that sketches where we might take this in the future. In other fields, there is a regular way of sharing data, preprint exchanges. We don't have that, and I think something like a Justice Data Commons and a regular exchange of data in close to real time rather than 2-year publication lags would be hugely important. And then to engage potential funding agencies and consider engaging the judiciary and judicial administration and tribunals in furthering this work. Thank you. And I'm going to scold myself for being the only panelist to go over time on the panel that I told nobody to be over time on, so apologies. But the good news is, because of all of the good work of my colleagues up here, we have time for questions. So I'm going to move back, but invite you, if you have questions, just because we do have a online audience, there's a microphone up here, and if you can come to the microphone with any questions, that'll make sure that anybody who's joining online can hear them. If there are no questions, I'm going to inflict my questions on people, so I really encourage you to ask questions.
Thank you very much for really interesting presentations, lots of data. Anyway, even in yours, Andrew. So I was really pleased. I have a question, especially when it comes to these indicators, like, how we guide the intervention, how do we make it more accessible, and so on. Have you had any type of conversation with either people who already have some data and would be willing to share beyond what is publicly available? Or I'm thinking there's lots of work in the poverty measurement of multidimensional indexes, right, that we could just borrow and adapt to the justice sector. Is that something that you're thinking of doing, or is there any conversation going on for just expanding the type of data we have access to? So both, I guess, Brian and Delphine, but relevant for everyone.
I'm happy to start. Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Yes. Thank you. The quick answer is yes, of course. We always look for more indicators. We always ask people for more data if they would like to share it. The difficulty is not drowning in indicators. In fact, in the first iteration of the dashboard, we had more indicators, and we've decided to cut back and kind of focus on what would be most relevant, because we realized the dashboard was becoming really clunky and difficult to use. It was not very user-friendly, very slow. So it's a matter of striking the right balance between what's readily available, what's relevant for as many stakeholders as possible. But yes, we are always considering adding new indicators. In fact, we now, after this work that we've done on disaster-related legal need, realizing just the importance of information around housing, we are thinking of adding new indicators around that. And as you pointed out, indicators of socioeconomic disadvantage, there are quite a few of them, but not all of them are easily available at various levels of geography. And this is kind of a key part for us to be able to include them in the dashboard. But there are other indicators that we look at that are not necessarily fit for dashboard or not for this one, but that we're interested in looking into, yes, definitely.
And I can just speak to what how we're thinking about, because this is still ours is still a work in progress. As I kind of mentioned quickly toward the end in describing what we're doing, or what we're in the process of doing, we're really aiming to use either like census data or things as publicly and easily accessible as census data as the indicators that are going to go into our index. And the reason for that is, again, so that we can have this broad coverage, and then also the fact that that's data that's going to be collected over time, and so it can be updated. I think that where more kind of other data sets come in that may be specific to certain geographies is that, one, that's going to help us understand which indicators might be relevant for, let's say, employment law issues or housing issues, and then we can translate to say, okay, these are general characteristics that social scientists have found are related, so that's something that we should think about putting in the index if it's available in this publicly accessible data. And then also just kind of, we're already anticipating, hoping that there'll be interest and people will look at the index and say, oh, this works well in my county or state, or this aspect of it doesn't work well, and I have a legal needs survey for my county or my state, and it's off in this way, or the indicator that you're using doesn't seem to fit. And I think that literature is part of kind of this bigger project will just help us all understand kind of, there's going to be a diversity of factors that are going to be relevant in different parts of geographies. But hoping to initiate that or be part of the beginning of that conversation, I think is where we see ourselves as hoping to put this project.
I also want to invite any of the panelists, questions for each other, given the types of work that we've kind of shared. If anybody has those, please feel free.
I'm curious about you opened with the shopfront scenario and then you ended with the digital platforms, which obviously is great. Short presentation, so a little bit more around the risk mitigation that the pendulum's gone, like where we balance the digital world and post-disaster. So, and how you've mitigated that balance.
It's a great question. Thanks, Chris. I think it's interesting. If you look at digital inclusion research, it shows that there are a lot of people who are digitally excluded, and I don't think you can do digital work without keeping that in mind and thinking about how you're doing that work. So, for example, our AI work, something that I found quite cool was, so we're doing that with the University of Melbourne, and it's about, it's been trained by lawyers, so hundreds of lawyers have trained based on structured data. They've gone through the data and tagged it. So that's how you train the algorithm. And it is quite effective. We're using that in our intake and triage and so on, and how we connect people to resources. One of the things that when we tested it, we found it didn't work so well for older people. Sorry. And we know that older people have lower levels of digital inclusion. And so what we did is we collaborated with our partners in the sector. We drew in more sources of structured data of older people explaining legal issues, and then retrained the model using that data. And it is now much, much more effective. But the thing that I love about it, and it's a human rights type example, is not only is it more effective for older people, it's more effective for everyone. So that's kind of an interesting example. It's consistent with our values. We, being client-centered is one of our values at Justice Connect. And your point's a really important one that goes beyond that, I think. We are part of a service response. We are not boots on the ground. We are not a local CLC that is dealing with people in abject crisis who've lost everything. And I don't say for 1 second that that is the service that we provide. We absolutely add value, but there needs to be this kind of network of services that are adequately resourced to deliver the response. And I don't think we have that at the moment, but I think it's a good question.
Sorry. We have a question online. This is from Thana at DIJ. Reading the question, all of these data and mapping are very interesting. Can any panelists give an example how presenting specific findings interest decision makers or influence policy making? So I'd open this one to the panel.
So I actually had slides that I didn't get to that I stuck. And we don't, obviously we don't have the okay, now I don't know if it's, sorry, I closed I won't be able to access this. Do you guys have it?
Oh, yeah, 9 a.m.
Hold on.
Oh, okay, sorry. So like, this is what we envision, because again, there's not an actual example of a policymaker coming to us because the index isn't complete yet, but we thought like a very simple example of what we might think about as like a housing law portion of our index is putting in these factors that have been found in the social science to predict or be related to landlord-tenant issues. Like, first of all, it has percent of households renting. If you're not renting, then you're going to have less exposure to landlord-tenant issues. And like I said, the percentage of households with incomes less than 50K, but more than 30% of their income spent on rent. Households with children are also seem to be more at risk of having landlord-tenant issues. People of color, percent of people of color, percent of population below the poverty level, and percent of adults of the adult population doubling up in housing. So these are all like prominent factors in the social science literature that relate to housing law issues. And so like mapping this, so just some data that we have from Iowa that's separate from the census data. So on the left is this kind of draft simple housing index as like a preliminary index. And then we have active attorneys per 10,000, which is one way where we might have tried to measure or think about access to justice. The correlation of our index to that is 0.2036. But if we think of like, maybe we're interested in housing matters that are served by Iowa, and again, this measure is not perfect, but it gets more at like where there's need to seeing where there's realized use of legal aid for housing matters. And so our index correlates with that by 0.4273. So if we have some success in that way in other aspects of the index, it's not, again, this is not the only measure, and we would never suggest that this would be like drive policy by itself, but I think it could be a piece. Sounds like a fire alarm. Yeah.
That does sound like a fire alarm, so I think we probably have to gather our things and leave.
You had a good answer there.
This is not an actual fire alarm.
Okay, good.
Sorry. Unless we
drill?
decided that they're going to do their fire alarm for everyone else, we have a floor exemption.
Carry on as if there is no beeping happening.
Extra challenge.
Great news, you can keep talking while this sound.
Right, yeah. Anyways, I said most of what I was gonna say. Yeah. So we just hope that this would help target areas. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have one very specific example, and I'm going to yell because I'm from New Jersey, so I can be very loud. But we actually worked on a household survey of access to justice in Jordan. This was about 5 or 6 years ago, and we were supporting a legal aid organization at the time. And Jordan has a system of Sharia courts, religious courts for family matters, but it's the official court for all family matters. And because the survey showed that, as you saw from some of the data, that family issues were one of the areas where low-income households were overly represented. So a colleague and I went and we met with the Chief Justice of the Sharia Court, and we started explaining this information. And the first thing he said was, "So you want to encourage Jordanian women to get divorced?" And we said, "No, what we want to do is we want to help you implement decisions that your judges have issued to help women from falling into poverty by paying alimony and child support." And he said, "Okay, I like this idea." And they set up an official referral scheme so that the women would go from Sharia court to the legal aid society. So, I mean, I think sometimes on a small scale, and I see in development protection orders, so like evidence on the data and evidence on the effectiveness of protection orders in domestic violence has also been very powerful. The problem is capacity to implement, which is usually a bit of a lag in low and middle income countries.
I had a bit more to add, but I don't know if I can speak over the beeping. I will try. Yes, it's the answer. We have used, we know that some of our indicators, especially the NLAS indicators, have been used by community legal centres to advocate for more funding or to bid for funding. I had something else in mind and the beepings just got me.
Is it ironic that a panel that has featured disaster responses has a fire alarm happening, which we don't need, we have been told not to leave for?
It came back to me.
Yes.
It just came back to me. With the information we've put in the dashboard, we've also packaged, I didn't show it, but we've also packaged it up in easy one-pager by local government area. So it's just a one-page, you pick your local government area and just get a one-page of all those indicators and how it differs from the state average. When some of the people in the sector saw these, they thought it was really useful, but then they asked us, can we do them by electoral division area rather than local government area? And then we realized they were using those to lobby their local MPs. So we've actually were able to extract that, and we've done that as a different separate resource. Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. We're going to turn this tone off on this floor within the next 15 minutes or no sooner. We can either carry on, it's up to the chair, or we could stop, break, start again, and have some questions before we get in. It'll be messy that way, but whatever you guys want to do. I don't know how tolerable this is.
Happy to push through if that's preferable.
I'm getting some sense on the panel to push through.
What did they want?
And sense from the floor, from the room, carry on. And I think maybe that's a metaphor for this work too. Carry on, push through, even though there may be setbacks and pushbacks.
This is a really long drill.
This is on. I thank you. Just right on time. I like Brian. I like your example of using legal aid data and relatively high correlation. Besides data of that sort, if you can get it, there is a very large number of helping organizations in almost every community. It's different from one community to another. Some of them very small. Some of them are large organizations with professional staff and so on. They might. Has anybody ever tried to collect data from organizations like that and put it into like a dashboard like arrangement? Because a lot, and we know from clinical experience and from legal needs surveys that a very large number of people go to those organizations because they're trusted. And that might be a way to get better data than census data as indicators.
That's a very good question, thank you. We have done quite a lot of work in analyzing service data from legal assistance providers, so it probably doesn't quite cover all those organizations you have in mind. And we did have this idea that we could potentially put side by side indicators of legal need, of potential legal need, and service data, so the legal need that is met by legal assistance providers. The difficulty is, in the Australian context, definitely, the data that we can get from legal assistance providers, and I'll refer to the work that the Victoria Law Foundation has done as well, is complex. It's not complete. it's not consistent across services, so it's very difficult to analyze meaningfully when we put it together. So that's the limitations. But yeah, it's definitely something that we keep digging into and hopefully make progress, on that front, to look at the data from the services that are being provided and the potential legal need, and where does that, like how well does it align or not, and what does that tell us when it doesn't align?
I don't know. My question relates to another potential data point, and we've had a fair number of disasters in California, big fires, and so many of our attorneys and service providers have lost their houses themselves or otherwise been impacted or are very close to people who are, talking to them, the trauma that they're experiencing, and then going and providing the service is a whole other thing, which is why those additional supports and information that can come in is useful. But I wonder if there's a way to collect information on that to sort of think through how we as a system respond more to that service provision challenge when you've lost your home or your family or other kinds of people, and you're navigating it yourself, but also trying to provide assistance. And if that's something we should be thinking about in designing our service delivery.
Thank you for that. We're just in the process of writing up our next project. It's a small qualitative project that is speaking with legal assistance providers in the community legal centres throughout New South Wales, with a focus on preparedness. So not only how they're supporting the communities prepare for disasters, but internally in their own organisations. And one of the big themes that has come out of that work so far is about, trauma-informed practice and how we're looking after each other and our communities, and what we need to put in place to kind of make sure that our services protect us, the service providers, and the communities that we're providing services for. So that report is only now just being written up, but we hope to have it out by the end of the year that will kind of look into a lot of those issues.
Just going to make one quick comment. Just one quick comment on that. I think there is the trauma and the people involved, but I think there's something about how legal centres are funded, because you look at the Northern Rivers and other centres that have been inundated or burnt down, they have been chronically underfunded for years. They don't have systems that enable them to store information in the cloud. They don't have proper communication systems on mobile phones. What does that resilience funding look like for them so they can continue operating? Because we know that this is the environment. So I think there is certainly the traumatic impacts of a disaster, but expecting that this will happen, how do we build a centre that can survive some of these sorts of issues?
If I can, I'm just going to jump back to a response to Ab's question before, and I think there can also be an opportunity to partner with, especially for academics, an opportunity to partner with organizations providing services, because so often we see organizations that are already stretched, underfunded, then being asked to provide and gather data. It's a heroic task to try and be asked, and it makes no sense, because the data that is often asked to be collected is to ensure further funding. And I think that's slightly different from questions about, that we should be asking, thinking about like a justice epidemiology approach. And when I go to a hospital, when I go to a health service provider, so often there is an opportunity to engage in research as a subject, which is often done by academic institutions in partnership with, but alongside the service delivery. So I think there's an opportunity for more of that, and that's one of my hopes in talking about this, is to try and see more of that type of work where the burden of gathering and analyzing and perfecting methods for gathering that data doesn't fall on the organization that is doing the work, but rather is shouldered by academics who can take the time to assist in doing that and do that kind of work. I'm mindful that we just responded to a question on trauma-informed practice, and yet here we are sitting through a blaring alarm. The other panel, just so everybody is aware, has broken, and they're going to return after this has stopped. Given that we're very close to time, I think unless anybody has any final comments, it might make sense for us to wrap here. Thank you for your forbearance with this. Thank you for all the panelists.